All right, we're continuing with the Imperialism unit, and these two sections are in the note packet are entitled Imperialism Case Study Nigeria and Europeans Claim Muslim Lands. So this first one is kind of a repeat of a question from the last section. In what two ways was imperialism in the 18th and 19th century different from the 15th and 16th? Europeans did not travel to the interior of Africa, and they did not have influence over the lives of people in Africa. So they did not in the 15th, 16th. They did in the 18th, 19th. All right, a famous author during the Age of Imperialism wrote this poem entitled The Black Man's Burden, and this author's name was Edward Morel. And in this, he had a really interesting insight into African imperialism. There's Edward Morel. It says, nor is violent physical opposition to abuse and injustice henceforth possible for the African in any part of Africa. His chances of effective resistance have been steadily dwindling with the increasing perfectibility and the killing power of modern armament. Thus, the African is really helpless against the material gods of the white man, as embodied in the trinity of imperialism, capitalistic exploitation, and militarism. So what was the black man's burden in here? It's that Africans were, as he put here, helpless to stop Europeans from overriding, from invading and ruling their nation. And because of their technology, the Africans were unable to stop Europeans from invading their country. I want to stop here and give you something to think about. Every so often, just the knowing the narrative of history makes a cultural sort of thing more fascinating. I'm going to give you an example of that. If you've seen the Marvel movie Black Panther, if you see it after you've studied the Age of Imperialism, it adds a whole new depth to that fictional story that's historically intriguing. You take into account Edward Morel's theory here that Africans were helpless to stop Europeans from using their technology to completely invade them and rule their nation, rule the continent. But what if there was a pocket of Africans who did have the technology to go toe-to-toe with Europeans, in fact, had the technology to dominate Europeans, and instead of getting involved, they chose to only care about themselves. And so the fictional situation that movie creates based on historical events is really, really interesting. It would have changed the whole dynamic of history had that been the case. There's a huge, great moral dilemma there for anyone who has power and sees someone else being abused and does nothing. What does that tell you about them? And then there's little things throughout the movie as well when they refer to the white character as a colonizer when he first visits the African kingdom in the movie. And those all have historical significance, and those sayings are all historically significant. So if you know the history, that movie becomes way more interesting. And it was already interesting. So I want to share that with you as an example of how that history can help that happen. All right, the one European nation and one African nation that resisted European influence was this nation of Ethiopia. Eventually, it was overrun by Italy, but we'll get to that, or attempted to be overrun by Italy. Another thing I'll share with you here that I think is interesting, all of these African nations were overrun by European nations, except Ethiopia. And if you're familiar with the New Testament, there was an early disciple named Philip who was told by what he thought was God, to go stand by the side of the road. Leave your ministry at church and go stand by the side of the road, which was curious. So as he's standing there, this caravan comes along, and there happens to be this eunuch, this high-ranking eunuch in one of the tents of this caravan, and he happens to be from the place called Ethiopia. And Philip is able to witness to this person. He's able to share with him the gospel because the guy was curious and he was reading the Bible and not understanding it. He even got baptized because after he became a Christian, he wanted to be baptized. And according to church history, that eunuch went back to Ethiopia, and a huge revival of Christianity happened in Ethiopia. And a lot of people embraced the religion, and a lot of them became Christians. So it's interesting to note, when Europeans came in the 1800s to Africa, The only area that they did not colonize, or the last area they colonized, was the one that had a history of Christianity in it. And there may or may not be a connection, but it's interesting to note. Nonetheless, maybe there is a connection there. If you know a different part of history, you can piece that story together. I'm going to continue on to the Europeans claim Muslim lands section because this one was so small, and do them both together. All right, this is the area of the world that was the Ottoman Empire at various times in history. It grew to encompass the Middle East and then some of Europe and some of Africa. But in the 1800s, this started to change. This empire started to lose its hold over this area. So the empire lost control over its Mediterranean lands. It had internal problems going on that they weren't as advanced as Europeans, and so they started losing territory. The political moves based off of a geographic reason, there's a special term for that, and that is geopolitics. So if you look in your vocab word, number one, politics, especially international relations, as influenced by geographic features. You probably could have written that in. It makes sense based on the word if you break it into parts. And a lot of actions happen because of this reason. So a couple of examples of Europeans taking Ottoman lands. Russia trying to take land from the Ottomans so they could have a water access to the Mediterranean to help their shipping industries. And oil being discovered in Persia, and that being a valuable commodity to help spur industrialization, and that European countries wanted that. All right, a conflict broke out over territory, Russia taking territory from the Ottomans, called the Crimean War. And something that happened during the Crimean War kind of set a standard for what would happen in wars going forward. There was a woman named Florence Nightingale who became a professional in her industry. She was a nurse, and she set the standard for the nursing industry, which would be so important in ministering to and healing, dealing with wounded soldiers' medical needs in the Crimean War, and then obviously World War I and World War II, where the needs would be even greater. All right, as the British expanded into Asia and conflicted with the Russians, there's one territory in particular where they fought over, and that is Afghanistan. It's been a series of an area of conflict for a long time. We'll bring that up when we get to the Cold War again. It also has significance then, which ties to our history. All right, another area of the Ottoman Empire that through nationalism was able to unite together and break away from the Ottomans was Egypt. This individual here, just happened to be named Muhammad Ali, was sent to Egypt to rule, like as a governor for the Ottoman Sultan. And sort of like Dom Pedro, he decided to rule by himself instead of under somebody else. One thing he did to help Egypt become a trading partner to the rest of the world is he developed an industry in Egypt, and that was the cotton industry. And even today, Egyptian cotton still is a high quality product. Another thing he did, as he was the leader who helped the British build the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal is a waterway that goes from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Right, so I'm not sure which is which, Mediterranean maybe to the Red Sea. So that you don't, in order to get from Europe to Asia, you can go through the Mediterranean, cut through the Suez Canal, and hit the Red Sea and be right there. As opposed to, if there was no Suez Canal, you have to go completely around Africa and back up the other side. So the Suez Canal is a canal built in Egypt that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. So for definition purposes. Right, the British gained control of this by helping finance the Suez Canal. And then when the very young country of Egypt was not able to pay the debt back for this work and this labor, the British took the canal as payment for it, which is probably what they wanted to begin with because their major colony was in India. All right, another example of conflict in Muslim lands. As I mentioned, oil was discovered in Persia. And the Persians didn't have the infrastructure to be able to harvest this and sell it globally. So what they did instead is they sold the rights to harvest oil to European companies who would come in and remove the oil themselves and then sell it for a profit. And the way that the Persian government made money was by selling the rights to do that work. A lot of Persians didn't like that. They felt like that deal was good for Europeans and bad for Persians. So they rebelled, like under the leadership of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. He was one of several people that felt like Persian people should be gaining the profit from this Persian product of oil, and Europeans were taking advantage of Persians, and so he led individuals in protesting the structure of that agreement.